Welcome to today's Explainer. We're diving into a topic that, honestly, usually stays hidden in the shadows, the spectrum of behavior, specifically demystifying paraphilic disorders. Now, I know just seeing that title might stir up some pretty strong emotions for you. Embarrassment, shock, maybe even repulsion. And you know what? That is completely natural. But our goal today is to strip away the stigma and look at this through a purely clinical, objective lens. We really want to separate the myths from the reality and keep this fundamental psychological truth in mind as we go. Having a thought or a fantasy is absolutely not the same thing as acting on it. So where exactly does the clinical line get drawn? Let's find out. Here is our roadmap for today's Explainer. First, we'll define what these disorders actually are. Then we'll explore their psychological and biological roots, distinguish between victimizing and non-victimizing behaviors, and finally, take a look at modern treatments. All right, Section 1, Defining Paraphilic Disorders. Where exactly is the clinical line? So to really wrap our heads around the disorder, we first have to understand the baseline term, which is paraphilia. Basically, these are compulsive sexual activities practiced by a small percentage of people that a given culture considers abnormal, deviant, or pathological. But listen, it's not just about an act being a little unusual. For the American Psychiatric Association to officially consider an interest of paraphilia, it has to hit three basic rules. First, the behavior has to be for the purpose of sexual arousal. Second, it tends to be highly compulsive, meaning the person really struggles to control it. And third, the clear majority of people in society must consider the behavior strange or deviant. But here's the kicker. Having a paraphilia does not automatically mean someone is psychologically ill. This comparison absolutely nails the difference. On one side, you have a standard paraphilia. This is a behavior freely engaged in, it doesn't cause personal distress, and there are absolutely no victims. It's just a deeply unusual interest. But the exact moment it crosses that line and becomes a diagnosable paraphilic disorder, that happens when it causes severe personal distress lasting over 6 months, or, and this is absolutely key, it involves a lack of consent. That is the crucial distinction we're making here. It's the distress or the violation of consent that actually turns it into a disorder. Moving right along to Section 2, the roots of paraphilias. Why and how do they even develop? Now here is a culturally fascinating point. Nearly all individuals who engage in paraphilias are men, and that's largely because most Western societies just give men way more permission to be highly sexualized from a very young age. But how does a specific person actually develop these intense compulsions? Well, psychologists generally point to three main theories. First is the psychodynamic theory, think Freud, which suggests these behaviors actually stem from repressed childhood traumas that act like invisible, powerful forces in adulthood. Then we have the behavioral theories. This argues that it's completely learned. Say a person accidentally associates sexual arousal with a specific object. That's classical conditioning. And then they reinforce it with physical pleasure, which is operant conditioning. Finally, biological theories point the finger at our actual chemistry, like an overproduction of testosterone or a wonky balance of neurotransmitters like serotonin. So what's the real answer? Honestly, it's probably a blend of the whole shebang. A random childhood event catches someone's attention, gets reinforced by pleasure over time, and is ultimately driven into a total obsession by an underlying biological vulnerability. To actually see that biological vulnerability in action, let's take a look at this data. This measures adrenaline production after giving subjects an adrenaline-enhancing drug. If you look at the normal controls compared to people convicted of a specific paraphilia, there is a massive difference, spanning a full 180 minutes. The individuals with the disorder produce significantly more adrenaline. To put that into perspective, this literally illustrates how chemical and hormonal imbalances might physically drive these incredibly powerful compulsions that just totally overwhelm a person's self-control. Okay, Section 3, Victimizing Paraphilic Disorders and the Complete Absence of Consent. Now we're getting into the darker side of the spectrum. In victimizing disorders, an unsuspecting victim isn't just an accident. Their absolute lack of consent is the core thing driving the arousal. Take voyeuristic disorder, for example, secretly watching others undress or engage in private acts. What makes this so alarming today is the terrifyingly small scale of modern micro-camera technology. This high-tech access has literally taken voyeurism from a creepy nuisance and escalated it into a highly exploitative, widespread crime. It's so bad it's actually prompting new laws all around the globe. But voyeurism isn't the only one we need to talk about. Other major victimizing disorders include exhibitionistic disorder. This is where arousal is directly triggered by the pure shock value of displaying one's genitals to an unwilling audience. Then there's frotteuristic disorder. This is the compulsion to rub against strangers in crowded public places, like a packed subway car. And sexual sadism disorder, where the clinical definition actually involves inflicting terror, pain, or humiliation on an innocent victim. The really crucial takeaway here is that the excitement in these specific acts stems directly from violating the boundaries of someone who did not agree to it. Make no mistake, these are illegal and they are predatory. And when we talk about victimizing disorders, we absolutely have to address pedophilic disorder. The exploitation of children is, without a doubt, universally the most reviled behavior on this entire spectrum, and the trauma it causes is devastating and lifelong. But I do want to draw your attention to a really surprising and frankly reassuring statistic: 62%. Because despite how prevalent and terrifying these cries seem when we watch the news, actual data shows that child sexual abuse rates in the United States have decreased by 62% over the past 20 years. So the awareness, the education, the preventative measures, they are actually working. Let's pivot now to Section 4, non-victimizing paraphilic disorders, focusing on solitary acts and consenting adults.
We use the word non-victimizing here for a very specific reason. These behaviors are strictly solitary acts or they involve fully consenting adults. A perfect example of this is consensual sadomasochism, often known as BDSM. Now, earlier we talked about sexual sadism as a violent crime, but when elements of bondage or discipline are ritualized, have incredibly strict rules, and absolutely everyone involved has explicitly agreed to it, it falls into a completely different category. Yes, it's technically still a paraphilia because it's a highly specific, atypical way to get aroused. But because of those strict rules and absolute consent, clinicians classify it as a non-victimizing behavior. As the source material points out, a lot of folks argue that what happens between consenting adults is really no one else's business. Then we have the purely solitary paraphilias. There's autoerotic asphyxiation, which involves intentionally depriving the brain of oxygen during masturbation to heighten the physical sensation. Now, while this is considered victimless, I cannot stress enough how incredibly dangerous it is. It actually accounts for nearly 1/3 of all strangulation deaths. Fetishistic disorder is much safer. This is simply an absolute reliance on non-sexual objects, think shoes, latex, or feet, to achieve arousal. And finally, there's transvestic disorder, which is dressing in a different gender's clothing for the specific thrill of sexual arousal. And we need to debunk a massive myth right here and now. The clinical data is crystal clear that transvestism does not mean a person is a gay man, and it definitely does not equate to identifying as transgender. It is simply a clothing fetish used for arousal. Nothing more. Which brings us to our final section, Section 5, treating paraphilic disorders. Can the mind actually be rewired? Well, first things first, we have to look at who actually seeks out treatment. The truth is, most people with harmless paraphilias never go to a doctor for it. The folks who end up sitting in a clinician's office are almost always there because of a court order, extreme personal distress, or because their compulsions have completely ruined their relationships. Which leads us to a pretty critical question. Do these treatments actually work? I mean, when a person is being driven by a powerful mix of biological urges and years of deep-seated psychological conditioning, can therapy really stop them from reoffending? Let's look at the sobering reality of the statistics here. The main treatment options we have include cognitive behavioral therapy to try and alter those underlying thinking patterns, covert sensitization to pair the fantasies with aversive, gross thoughts, orgasmic reconditioning to retrain physical climax triggers, and SSRI drugs to try and balance out serotonin levels. And the objective conclusion from the data? Success is marginally effective at best. It's a tough reality. The data shows that the absolute highest chances of success rely heavily on two very specific things: incredibly early intervention and a genuinely massive level of self-motivation from the patient to stop the behavior. And that leaves us with a truly profound puzzle to think about. If these atypical desires are literally hardwired into a person by a complex mix of their biology and their conditioning, where exactly does personal responsibility begin and a clinical disorder end? It is arguably the ultimate challenge for both human psychology and our criminal justice system, because while having a thought is definitely not a crime, our behaviors have very real, very permanent consequences in the real world. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, diving deep into the science beneath the taboo.